Sometimes it takes the horror of war to bring out the best of humanity. Unexpected acts of mercy from the unlikeliest of places. It was December 20th, 1943, and Lieutenant Charlie Brown's B-17 bomber named Ye Old Pub was crippled and struggling to make it out of German airspace following a bombing mission over Bremen. German fighters scrambled as the listing bomber fell further and further out of formation. The first to reach it was German ace Franz Stigler, who pulled up to the defenseless bomber and saw the terrified and wounded crew. Miraculously, instead of squeezing off a round of gunfire, Stigler escorted the plane out of German airspace, even shielding it from other fighters. Brown made it home and served out the rest of the war, never mentioning the incident. Stigler did the same. In 1990, they met for the first time and became best of friends. "I wouldn't be here if not for your mercy," Brown said. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler passed away within months of each other in 2008. It was Christmas Eve 1944, and deep in the Hurtgen forest, a mother and 12-year-old son prepared a quiet Christmas dinner. Elizabeth and Fritz Winken were startled by a knock on the door. It was 3 American soldiers, freezing, exhausted, one of them badly wounded. Elizabeth let them in, knowing it was a crime punishable by death. She ripped up bedsheets for bandages and cooked more food. There was a second knock. It was 4 German soldiers, freezing and seeking shelter. She nervously let them in, but insisted the guns stay outside. The two sides stared at each other in disbelief until one of the Germans began tending to the wounded American. The others broke bread. They slept on the floor through the night, the Germans and Americans. The next morning, one of the Germans gave his map and compass to the Americans. "Avoid Monschau," he said in broken English. "We took it back." It saved their lives. They would all survive the war. Navy signalman 3rd Class Elgin Staples found himself submerged in the warm August waters off Guadalcanal. A Japanese torpedo had ripped a hole through his cruiser, and the only thing keeping him alive was a rubber life belt cinched across his waist. After 8 hours of bobbing among the wreckage-strewn waters, Staples was fished out and saved. On leave and flying back to the States, he noticed that the life belt was manufactured at the Firestone Company in his hometown of Akron, Ohio. Elgin also noticed some serial numbers on the inside, but thought little of it. Back home in Akron, Elgin relived his harrowing tale for Mom, and even showed her the miraculous piece of rubber that saved his life. An ashen look came across her face as she stared at the oil-stained rubber belt. "Son," her voice cracked in a barely audible whisper. "I'm an inspector at Firestone, and this is my inspector number," she said through tears. A mother had put her arms halfway around the world to save her boy. Elgin Staples would live to be 86 years old. It was 2 words that changed a family forever. It happened in July of 1944 during the Battle of Guam, where 19-year-old Private First Class James Creamer was on night patrol of the perimeter guarding their position. Creamer and his platoon were preparing for a nighttime attack. At that very moment, halfway around the world in a Baltimore hospital, James' mother lay in a bed, recovering from breast cancer surgery, drifting in and out of consciousness, her husband at her side. Suddenly she sat up, her eyes wild. "Duck, James!" she screamed, and then passed out. Several weeks later, they received a letter from James. "Dearest Mom and Pop," the letter read, "the strangest thing has happened. Our unit was on high alert for a nighttime attack when I heard a woman's voice piercing through the silence of the jungle, clear as a bell. At the sound of it, I ducked, just as a bullet whizzed past my head, skimming the top of my helmet. What luck." "That wasn't luck, James." The B-17 Flying Fortress was being knocked around in the skies over Kassel, Germany, struggling to stay airborne. The Tondelayo, part of the 379th Bomb Group based in Kimbolton, was fighting valiantly to make it back home. Bleeding and dizzy from a lack of oxygen, tail gunner Michael Aruth managed to shoot down multiple German fighters that were about to unload on the crippled plane. He would earn the Distinguished Flying Cross for his heroics. Miraculously, the plane made it back, and mechanics were astonished to see an unexploded 20mm shell lodged in the fuel tank. It should have turned the Tondelayo into a towering inferno, but it didn't. The teary-eyed crew discovered that the explosive charge in the shell had been replaced by a scribbled note, written in Czech, which said, "Sorry, this is all we can do for you now." The plane was saved by an unknown Czech prisoner of war. This brave soul saving the lives of the crew of the Tondelayo. He was a medic in the Army's 76th Infantry Division and had outlived 8 medics in his company. His unit had just crossed the Rhine River and was engaged in fierce house-to-house combat in Camberg, Germany, just weeks before the war would end. He was Gregory Kirchner, and it was pouring rain in the middle of the night when he heard a scream for help. A soldier had stepped on a landmine, his leg blown off at the hip. As the soldier lay bleeding to death, he gasped his final words to Kirchner. "My name is Glenn Jones. My wife is expecting. Please tell her I love her." Kirchner would spend the next 60 years searching for Glenn's wife, and with the help of the VA, he finally made contact with her just months before he passed away. "It was like hearing from Glenn himself," said a teary Virginia when she got the unexpected call from Greg. "It was a true miracle. Greg is an angel." He had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1940 and was assigned to a metallurgy shop in Chicago. But hours after Pearl Harbor, he requested a transfer to combat. His name was Ted Cummings, and he became a gunnery specialist with the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, Edson's Raiders. He was among the first wave of Marines to storm the beaches of Tulagi in August of 1942, a heavily fortified speck of rock 20 miles north of Guadalcanal. After 48 hours of brutal combat, Cummings and 8 Marines found refuge in what remained of the governor's palace. Cummings was catatonic from fear and exhaustion, on the verge of collapse, barely able to function. Somehow, a piano was still standing among the rubble, and then he heard it. A Marine began playing the very last song that Cummings heard as he said his goodbyes to his parents years earlier. "At that moment, I knew I would make it through the war," he would recall on his 90th birthday in 2014. "It was as if they were reaching out to me through that song." She had taken a job at the Pioneer Parachute Company to help with the war effort. It was the summer of 1942, and factories were desperate for labor to make munitions and supplies of war. Her name was Estella Hillman, and just a year earlier, she had sent her only son Robert off to basic training to become a paratrooper with the legendary 101st Airborne. Robert would spend much of the war training for the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, where he would be among the first to land behind enemy lines as part of the pre-dawn invasion. Mother and son exchanged frequent letters, Estella fretting about typical motherly concerns, and Robert delighting in her work to support the boys abroad. Their reunion in June of 1945 was a joyous and tearful one. "I knew I would jump safely," said Robert, his arms enveloping her in a hug. "Why?" said his delighted but quizzical mother. "Because I saw your initials on my chute," he told his stunned mother as he handed her a tattered section of the parachute with her initials on it. He remembered it vividly. It occurred on the outskirts of Bastogne in the Belgian Ardennes on Christmas Day in 1944. It was the Battle of the Bulge, and James Money and the 4th Armored Division were on a mission to fight through German heavy armor and infantry to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne, who were still holding on in Bastogne. A religious man, Money had felt God's presence with him since landing on Utah Beach in mid-July of that year. Like many GIs, Money had left a wife and 2 young children back home. He carried with him a locket of his youngest son's hair in a metal pocket watch that he kept in his breast pocket to be near his heart, as a reminder of what awaited him back home. Suddenly a shot rang out, and Money was knocked to the ground, tufts of his son's hair flying everywhere. He had been hit by a German sniper, but miraculously it ricocheted off the pocket watch, leaving him unharmed. "I thank God that he was watching over me," James Money tearfully recalled of his miracle at Bastogne. She was still recovering from surgery and drifting in and out of consciousness, her husband Harry gently holding her hand. Her name was Mamie Creamer, and though mired with her own health issues, her thoughts never strayed far from her son James. Just a year earlier, in 1943, they had been celebrating James's 18th birthday at home in Baltimore, and now he was in faraway Guam, a private first class with the Army's 77th Infantry. They wrote each other every week, James never failing to tell Mom the latest. As the anesthetic fog lifted from Mamie in her hospital room, she jolted herself upright. "Doc James!" she screamed out at nobody in particular before collapsing back into her bed. Several weeks later, a letter came from James. "Mom, the strangest thing has happened. Our unit was on high alert for a nighttime attack when I heard a woman's voice piercing through the silence of the jungle. At the sound of it, I ducked, just as a bullet whizzed past my head. What luck." "Maybe that wasn't luck, James. He was part of the 530th Engineer Company, and they had just completed building a bridge across the Pasig River in the heart of Manila. It was February 1945, and they had encountered brutal Japanese resistance along the way, as well as prisoner of war camps that they would liberate. He was Corporal Francis Callahan, and growing up in the south side of Chicago, he was particularly close to his Uncle Sam and Aunt Cecilia, and their 3 young daughters. Nobody had heard from them since 1942, when they were in Manila on business as it was overrun by the Japanese. Dodging snipers, Francis stumbled upon the notorious Bilibid prison, which housed some 300 civilian survivors from the Bataan Death March. "Cousin Francis," a chorus of voices rang out. As he turned his head, he couldn't believe his eyes. His 3 cousins, along with their parents. They were emaciated but alive. "God has answered our prayers," is all they could say through the tearful reunion. All would survive the war. He was flying his first combat mission as a navigator on a B-17 bomber, and the soon-to-be 19-year-old had an uneasy feeling all morning. It was April 21st, 1945, and the weather was brooding and ominous. Nothing but dark clouds across the horizon. He was Lieutenant James Bowling, and he expected the mission to be called off, but it wasn't. At 20,000 feet, pilot Frank Bell became disoriented through the cloud cover and they fell out of formation. It was then that Bowling, a man of deep faith, heard a voice whisper, "Jump." At that moment, the plane stalled and entered a spin. "Jump!" the voice came back louder. Bowling shouted, "Abandon ship," but nobody followed, so he jumped, his parachute floating him gently to the ground. Just seconds after exiting the plane, a crack reverberated through the air. The plane had exploded from anti-aircraft fire. All but 3 of the crew would perish, and James Bowling would carry a lifetime of survivor's guilt. She took a job at the Firestone plant in Akron, Ohio, to help with the war effort following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Her name was Vera Staples, and she would write as often as possible to her only son, Elgin, who was a signalman 3rd class aboard the USS Astoria, a cruiser stationed in the Pacific. She was proud to learn about the Astoria's participation in the pivotal battles of Coral Sea and Midway and kept track of its whereabouts through the news. Vera was crestfallen to learn that the Astoria had been sunk at the Battle of Savo Island and that 1,000 sailors had perished. It was only weeks later that she learned that Elgin survived, thanks to a rubber life belt cinched across his waist which kept him afloat for 12 hours in the roiling sea. When Elgin returned home, he showed his mother the piece of rubber that had saved his life. "My God," she gasped as she ran her fingers over the inspection numbers on the belt, tears streaming down her face. "That's my number, son. I inspected this belt." In the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, 20-year-old Private Robert Hillman did a final inspection of his gear as the C-47 he was aboard neared the drop zone. Hillman quietly chuckled to himself when he saw that the parachute was made at the Pioneer Parachute Company, located just miles from his family home in Manchester, Connecticut. Seconds later, he let out an audible guffaw, drawing attention from the stoic and surely nervous jumpers around him. "What gives?" an agitated voice rang out. Still in disbelief from what he had just seen, an incredulous Hillman simply responded, "I know my chute is going to work." "How do you know that?" a second skeptical voice responded. "Because my mother works for the Pioneer Parachute Company, and her initials are on my chute." It may be the most remarkable coincidence on one of the most remarkable days in history, or was it something more? Hillman's chute worked. He survived the war and brought home a sliver of the parachute to show his mother. He dropped out of school in 8th grade to help his family make ends meet during the Depression. At 12 years old, he learned how to swim, thanks to a teacher at the YMCA named Dale McGinnis, who assured him it would come in handy someday. His name was William Ingram, and on his 17th birthday he enlisted in the Navy, following in the footsteps of his older brother. Ingram was on board the USS Houston in February of 1942 when it was sunk in the calamitous Battle of Java Sea, one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. Giving his life vest to a friend, Ingram treaded the oily water for 2 days before being scooped up by the Japanese. He was one of only 368 survivors. Ingram spent the remainder of the war working on the notorious Burma Railway, weighing only 90 pounds when he was liberated in 1945. Returning home to Illinois, the first stop he made was to the YMCA to see Dale McGinnis. "You were right," Ingram told the man who taught him to swim. "It came in handy."